Hello! This is not part of our regularly scheduled series of posts about media franchises. This is actually a video response to a recent review of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. The reviewer made a valiant attempt to appreciate this first of Jane Austen's novels, of which there are 6, but ultimately found the plot too simple, the themes too obsessed with marriage, the writing too uninteresting, and above all, the package just too dull to finish up. But she graciously invited comment, so here is my attempt at defense of Jane Austen's darkest, roughest novel. There will be many spoilers, although I'll try to keep some amount of discretion. Since it's the 200th anniversary of the release of Sense and Sensibility in 1811, I recently reread the novel for the 3rd time. First and second times I read it, I actually would tend to agree with a lot of people who think it's her weakest novel or that she's not very interesting. The beginning is not very dramatic. It starts off with a recitation of family history and characters who've died before we even see any dramatic scenes. The plot tends to flag in the middle. There's a bunch of stuff where they go to London and they just sort of wait for letters. And the characters really aren't as instantly engaging as Pride and Prejudice, although I think if you truly enter into them with their emotional struggles, they can be just as poignant and powerful. However, if you think about it, many of the structures and relationships really seem like a draft, or an early attempt at a draft of Pride and Prejudice. There's 2 sisters, the older one's sensible, the younger one more impulsive. There are mothers and mother figures obsessed with marriage and marrying their daughters and friends' daughters off. There are dictatorial older women, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice clearly is the descendant of Mrs. Ferrers in Sense and Sensibility. There are myriads of secret engagements, elopements, and seductions. In fact, I feel like if you put Sense and Sensibility in a blender, add a bit more wit, a bit more vivacity, and a bit more drama, out would come Pride and Prejudice. And in fact, that seems to be what Jane Austen did, since Pride and Prejudice came out 2 years later in 1813. Pride and Prejudice is more light and bright and sparkling, as Jane Austen herself wrote, and has a much bigger community surrounding it as a result. However, I think if you look at Sense and Sensibility merely as a draft of Pride and Prejudice, or a philosophical comparison, or even just a romance novel, it's too reductionistic. I think Jane Austen's genius resides heavily in the fact that she is in such crucial control of every element of her narrative. Nothing appears in her novels that does not have an emotional effect, actually several emotional effects, and many plot events will hinge on everything that appears. I believe that she wrote Sense and Sensibility as a darker and seemingly plainer novel than Pride and Prejudice on purpose. If she'd wanted to write another light, happy novel, she could have, and in fact did, when she wrote both Northanger Abbey and Emma. However, Sense and Sensibility takes a harsh look at the consequences of selfish immaturity, greed, and passion that cause such misery in the Regency, and I would argue today, if we look at our own behaviors, they're not that far from the cruel or even merely misguided characters in Sense and Sensibility. Everything is on a more intense scale than in the usual Austen novel. The villains are crueler. You have the vicious selfishness of Fanny Dashwood, the barbaric dictatorial nature of Mrs. Ferrers, and the sadistic needling of Lucy Steele. The depths to which characters sink are lowered. Several of them almost die. They catch violent illnesses. There are 2, not 1, but 2 out-of-wedlock pregnancies, statutory rape, even a duel, although many of these things are related off-screen. And I think as a result of these depths, the heights of joy at the end are much more relieving. There's a long section in the novel which feels like they're really not doing a whole lot, and there's a lot of involved misunderstandings and confusions. But when you finally get to the end and there's that moment of reconciliation and happiness, I felt almost a physical release upon finishing the novel. In fact, even the first time when I was struggling through it, there was a sense of a huge weight being lifted off my shoulders, and I could breathe clear air after so long in the nightmares that the characters have to go through. Only in Emma, I think, did Jane Austen really achieve that kind of sense of happiness after trial. But Emma's a whole other topic I'll do another time. In addition to the intensity which the darkness enhances, Austen also fills the novel with literary references and discussions. I think the most prominent of these is the beautiful reworking of King Lear's scene, in which Lear's daughters whittle down his honor guard, saying, "Oh, he won't need that." Austen brilliantly reworks this in the scene where Eleanor and Marianne's half-brother and his wife whittle down their proposed generosity after their father's death. The barbaric selfishness that's displayed by these two characters is only equaled by their attempts to cloak it in the language of affection and generosity. So I think that's truly a great Shakespearean reworking. In terms of adaptations, there's nothing that really equals the polish and wit of the 1995 adaptation by Emma Thompson and directed by Ang Lee. However, for my own taste, I prefer the rougher, somewhat derivative, but very well cast and longer 2008 BBC miniseries of Sense and Sensibility. I think that the longer length allowed it to have more detail in looking at the minor characters and events that didn't make it into the film for economy's sake. I think that the casting of Eleanor particularly really is what won me over to this production. Hattie Moorhan's performance has so much intelligence and compassion, kindness, selflessness, and just a true mastery of what makes a really attractive character. Not necessarily beautiful, because Moorhan's face is not classically beautiful, but the character she displays means that at the end of the series, I was perfectly willing to admit she was the person I was most interested in and found most attractive. All in all, I enjoyed the review to which this is a response, and encourage anyone who's had trouble with Sense and Sensibility, among whom I've numbered myself, to give it another chance. The novel is well worth the time it takes to finish, and I think it will reward anyone who tries.